Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
We think the worst form of competition to be in is one where you don't really know you're in that competition. And that was what happened to, say, Encyclopedia Britannica, when you were sitting there worrying terribly about whether other reference books were going to be better than you, and suddenly you're taken apart by something like Wikipedia. Why do we think that? Because when we look at government at the moment, or Western government, we think it's in roughly the same state, in a competition it doesn't quite know it's in. And if I look at the European elections last week, I look at the midterms coming up in America in November, I see the same thing, which I would describe as a version of discordant apathy. And it is where voters are very, very angry, very, very cross with the politics that they have, not just in terms of the approval ratings of politicians. Three most popular politicians at the moment are outside Parliament. It's also to do with the parties. The Conservative Party used to have 3 million members. Now it's got 128,000. That was a business. It would be out of business. It's also the sense that despite being very angry, very cross, nothing is going to change, no matter what the voters do, no matter what politicians do. That is the kind of prevailing thoughts, actually on both sides of the Atlantic at the moment. It's wrong for a good reason and a bad reason. Good reason is that really, if you look at history, Western government has kept on reinventing itself. It does change. It changes in really dramatic ways. The fact it hasn't really changed much for, we would argue, almost 100 years doesn't mean it's not going to revert to type and start changing again. And the second good reason is technology. If you really think that the wave of changes has gone all the way through the private sector, if you really think those changes are not going to hit the public sector, well, then I think you can justifiably say, well, look, none of this stuff is going to happen. But we think would be extremely surprising if that did not happen. The bad reason is that actually, yes, this time the West is in a competition to do with values, competition to do with democracy, because now, finally, Asia has an alternative method of government, and Asia, remember, we will argue, at one time was miles ahead of us. And from their perspective, this is coming back, and so that introduces the three revolutions of Western government, which is the reason why we think the West climbed ahead. And here's Adrian.
If you go back to the year 1600, I think only a madman would ever have predicted that Europe would become the dominant power in the world. You might have thought it would be the Ottoman Empire or perhaps India, and you might well have thought it would have been China. In 1600, there were 3 cities in Europe that had populations of more than 300,000 people. That was the population of the Forbidden City alone in Beijing. And many of those 300,000 people were Mandarin civil servants selected from the whole of this huge country by objective, merit-based examinations. It was an extraordinary system of government. And yet, over the next 300 or 400 years, the West pulls relentlessly ahead, essentially because it has 3 great revolutions in government. The first revolution was a public order revolution. It was the revolution that was created by the rise of the nation-state. We regard the great symbol, the great philosopher of this revolution, essentially as Thomas Hobbes, the author of Leviathan, because he said that the fundamental thing that the state must do is provide public order. And that is exactly what the nation-state does over the next few hundred years. It gets rid of all these warring barons who've been tearing countries apart. It gets rid of wars of religion by saying essentially that the king should decide the religion of his people, creates public order. But it creates public order in a way that doesn't get rid of competition. You have order within states, but competition between states for preeminence, diplomatic preeminence, military preeminence, trading preeminence. So in China, when they invent gunpowder, they use it to create fireworks. We use it to create wars. They may be more civilized than us, but we tended to dominate for the next few hundred years because of that. In China, when they traded with other countries, the emperor got very upset about this, and he basically said to all the people who lived on the rich southern coast in the mid-16th century, you have to move 17 miles inland. We don't want you contaminated by these other people around the world. Europe, by contrast, trades with the rest of the world create empires with the rest of the world. All these countries are constantly competing with each other. Spain has its Latin American empire, and of course, Britain has a huge empire all around the world. Order within, competition between countries, external power. That's the first revolution, the public order revolution. The second revolution is the liberal revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This is a revolution that we tend to associate with France or with America, but the country that we find really intriguing in this period is Britain, partly because we're British, partly because Britain was the great global power of the time, it was the America of its time, but partly because what Britain does in this period has extraordinary resonance with the situation of the state today. Between 1815 and 1848, Britain essentially reduces taxation from about £80 million a year to £60 million a year, but it does that at the same time that it makes government smaller, more efficient, more accountable. It's providing schools, it's providing hospitals, it's providing roads, it's providing a sewerage system at a time when the population is actually growing by 50%. How does it pull off this extraordinary miracle? Gladstone said he went round government saving candle ends and cheese pairings for the good of the country. But more importantly, it's by changing the nature of government. Government in the 18th century was essentially a system of sinecures, pensions, rent-seeking for the ruling class, Micklethwait's ancestors. And what it did was to rip out these sinecures and this rent-seeking and say you must compete on the basis of open competition to get jobs in the civil service, that government functions must be utilitarian, they must provide services for the people. So you can focus government, contract the state, but also provide services for the people. That's a great revolution. It makes the state more efficient, more accountable, and more defensive of fundamental individual freedoms. In the late 19th century, however, you get two complaints about this what we call lean government liberalism. One is that it's not compassionate enough. You get Dickens talking about grad grind in hard times. You get John Stuart Mill, the great prophet of libertarianism, saying that actually what does open competition for the civil service mean if some people aren't getting enough education to become part of this competition? At the same time, the British are looking over at Germany and saying, wait a minute, Germany's got an activist state, a state that's building tariffs, a state that's building schools, a state that's building universities, and they're leaping ahead of Britain when it comes to the new technology of engineering and chemicals, the new industries of the time. So there's a push towards a more activist state. And this lays the foundations for what we call our third revolution, which is the rise of the welfare activist state